Violence! I want to talk to you today, Mr. B, about violence, or apparently the history of violence,
Oh,
specifically.
please don't. I'm afraid of blood, and particularly my own.
Oh, and yet you're a conflict archaeologist. Oh, the plot thickens. Oh, yeah, looking all coy. Um,
That's a long discussion for another day.
Yeah, yeah, we shall save that psychoanalysis drama for another day. But specifically, it's an article in the New Scientist magazine this week, which has a headline and an imagery at the front, which is absolutely up my street. The headline being "The Tribe That Rewrote History," with a very dramatic Stonehenge on fire kind of landscape in the background
I
there.
thought it was an advert for the new series of Game of Thrones, like you're getting everywhere else.
No, no, we're not going to go down. No, bad, Andy. We're not. But the subtitle to that headline though was interesting as well. DNA reveals the untold story of the ultimate Stone Age conquerors. And what's interesting though is that I didn't suggest this story for this month's agenda. You actually got in touch to point me in the direction of this article yourself, having come across it seemingly via Twitter. Because for me, this isn't a particularly dramatic or astonishing thing. These conversations have been going on for the past 60 or 70 years. In fact, I'll come back to that in just a moment. But why? How did you hear about this story?
Well, I'm a relatively regular reader of New Scientist. I think it's a great magazine for catching up in a popular way, but in a quality way with the kind of research that isn't my normal field. So, for example, they often run stories about work on early hominids, which is something I find interesting, but it's not something I'm a specialist in. So, in terms of keeping up with the latest data on that, and it's written often by the scientists themselves, but in a popular form, or by trained science journalists, and so you get detail, you get evidence, you get argument, and all for £4.99 available in the supermarket near you. It's I think it's the kind of publication we should have more of, and particularly in archaeology. So that's it. This particular story I picked up actually though through social media.
Okay.
References to it and to a subsequent story in the Daily Mail in particular started popping up on my Twitter feed, so I started looking into it, and the moment I started to read the article and then read the Mail piece and then started reading around it, it was an absolute shout out, stand out to do a watching brief discussion, because it actually covers a lot of the issues that we've talked about ever since we started doing watching brief, and so hopefully we can at least raise a few issues, make a few points, and get people to read around. And maybe like me, actually, I'll put my cards on the table, end up still sitting on the fence at the end of it.
Okay, interesting. Because the reason why I find it interesting, and first of all, I just want to just echo, yes, a great publication, available in every newsagent I basically go into, and the closest equivalent, I suppose, in archaeology would be current archaeology,
Or Britarch as well, British
or
archaeology.
Britarch, yeah.
Certainly in Britain. I don't know about overseas, but certainly in Britain.
No. But sadly, neither are routinely available in newsagents. So this is a great magazine. But the reason why I find that this story not that surprising is that actually it's kind of reheating and revisiting an idea that's been posited by prehistorians for the better part of the past century, talking about and asking the question about how it is that material culture that we see, things like pottery and tools and burial customs, migrated across the continent. And at the beginning of the 20th century, you had people suggesting that this represented a movement of people physically moving from place to place and bringing with them certain trends in material culture. Towards the end of the 20th century, that moved shifted, well, broadly speaking, that mood shifted towards a sense of it being cultural, I suppose, appropriation, you could say, or put cultural trading into a certain extent. People taking on a new trend in material culture, but not actually physically moving. The idea of the things like pottery coming with certain materials or certain perhaps hashish, this kind of thing, that would invoked certain religious fervour that would have spread
Yes.
without having to move in yourself and make sure people were using this pottery. And now this genetic research is starting to move that back again, away from simply an idea and pots, as it were, moving, back to people moving. And it's not that controversial, but it is curious though. First of all, the reaction to this idea, but also it's curious how they're rushing again to an absolute answer in this research. Surely one would have hoped that over the past 60, 70, 80 years we would have learned that maybe the answer is, as you say, somewhere in the middle. In this instance, the idea is that there are people who were on the Eurasian steppe in let's see, the Caucasus Mountains, no, north of the Caucasus Mountains.
It's the called the Pontic Caspian area, the steppe at the north, basically the north end of the Caspian Sea.
Exactly, yeah, and that they moved, or started to move, westwards and probably eastwards as well, with their particular material culture, having conquered or mastered the art of horse riding and also making wheels and this kind of thing. And these are traits that we do start to see in this sort of Neolithic Bronze Age transition. The earliest wheel tracks in Britain, I think, come from the Bronze Age, for example, and this also ties in with, and it's probably important just to lay a little bit of this theoretical groundwork as well. This also ties in with the idea that people were violent in prehistory. Again, there was a tendency in the past to almost paint a sort of a prehistoric Eden kind of idea. The notion that people just got on with each other. Populations were relatively dispersed, quite easy going because the land wasn't being contested, and so there was less violence. But actually, increasingly, we're acknowledging that prehistory was quite violent, and in some places there is even acknowledged acts of warfare, intertribal, interclan warfare, in even in Northern Europe, where some of these, I'm not saying that Northern Europeans are inherently peaceful, but that is to say, where you would have thought that these relationships, say between hunter-gatherers and farmers, would have been worked out by the time they get into Northern Europe. That's not the case. It seems as though the past basically was a violent place. There wasn't this
I'm thinking of a song from the musical Oklahoma called "The Farmer and the Cowboy Should Be Friends."
Yeah. Well, exactly. It's that kind of notion, and the question is,
and that goes right down to the 19th century.
Well, it did, yeah. And the question is whether or not the farmer and the cowboy, or the I suppose the fisherman and the farmer, were moving, trading, or replacing one another in this crucial period. This is just after some of the main features of Stonehenge were put in place, and the article actually here goes on to talk about how, actually there's a quote here, the genetic analysis showed that the Britons who built Stonehenge all but disappeared within a few generations of the Yamnaya's arrival. That's the people migrating.
The culture. That's the name that's given to the culture, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly, across Europe.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a very complicated picture, because we also have the movement of a very well-known type of pottery, beaker bells, and also beaker bell pottery, and also corded ware beaker pottery as well. Yeah. You may have heard of people out there may have heard of beaker people, and it looks like there's a lot happening, basically, is what I'm getting at, and it seems that despite the headline here, this story is probably much more messy than they'd like us to think.
I think, first of all, the thing that struck me about it, and again, I'm coming to it as a non-specialist. Unlike you, I'm not a prehistorian, but I do find that particular period fascinating, because at the end of it, we get some of the foundations of modern, certainly Western culture, certainly in terms of iconic stories and storytelling. So we get the Homeric legends, for example, of Troy and the Odyssey, and
but also staples such as farming are in place.
Indeed.
Have increasingly hierarchical societies, it seems.
Absolutely, yeah, the development of urbanism and so on. Yeah. So it's a crucial period in our cultural development, but what struck me about this are, well, first of all, it's almost as if we're narrowing in to begin with. It's almost as if it's the and we've talked about this before on Watching Brief. It's the magic bullet theory. It's the answer that solves all the questions. But the moment you start to look into it forensically, you suddenly realise that, first of all, we're talking about they're talking in DNA terms quite a compressed period of time.
Yep.
But if you look at the archaeological data, we're looking at about a much more expansive period of time. And in fact, if you start to read around it, there is an argument that the archaeological DNA specialists have not paid enough attention to the nuances of the archaeology, the material culture that they're talking about.
Yeah.
So, for example, one of the markers they talk about is burials, warrior burials, with what appears to be a ritual covering of powdered ochre.
Yeah.
And they talk about that as being a marker of the Yamnaya.
So
however,
a cultural practice as opposed to a genetic marker.
Cultural practice is associated with these incoming people, alleged incoming people.
Yeah.
It's then pointed out that there's a burial from the Iberian Peninsula which exhibits exactly the same apparent covering of ritual ochre, which is several hundred years before the alleged incursion of the Yamnaya.
Yeah.
So who's copying who?
Yeah, exactly. Who's copying who? Who's perhaps a single individual maybe is married into a society and brought with them their traditions. Again, it's a complicated story, but also crucially, it's and this is something I said to you off camera before we started this recording. Crucially, not everyone in Britain or Europe has been genetically tested. I haven't been sampled ever, for example. Have you ever had your genes mapped?
No, thought about it once or twice, but never got round to it.
No, exactly, yeah. So we're talking in very distinctive and, as you say, magic bullet terms, very definite terms, in terms of answers. But actually, the reality in terms of the test that's been done is far from over. And I suspect that while it's really attractive to be able to write a dramatic headline and have artwork like that on the front of a magazine, it's not necessarily the actual story. And the idea that one day, towards the end of the Neolithic, all men, in particular, men in Britain, for example, were just replaced, that's very strange. Because
I think we should make one of the arguments is that on the sampling that has been done, the archaeological DNA experts put one view, which is that the male genetic markers for the Neolithic population disappear and are replaced by these Yamnaya male genetic markers, even though there may be some continuity in the mitochondrial DNA on the female line.
Yeah.
The implication being that the male population was somehow enslaved or killed off, and the incomers took all the women.
Yeah, it's very Conan, isn't it? It's very Conan the Barbarian.
Absolutely, and I think that's part of the problem I've got with this. That it apart from the simplicity of the magic bullet thing, it almost and again no, actually I'll go one other place before I go to that point.
Okay.
In terms of the archaeological context, there are a number of other things in play that aren't fully considered, to my mind, in this kind of solution. One is the possibility, and we know that it was happening through that period, is that there was climatic variation going on, which would have impacted on the populations in various ways.
Yeah, well, it looks like populations were dropping a little bit, probably because food couldn't sustain them. Yeah,
absolutely. And also, Christensen, one of the scientists working on this, suggests that in a site in Sweden, they've got evidence. I think it's from dental plaque, isn't it, of what are potentially plague bacteria or plague-causing bacteria, which could. It's only one sample, but it could suggest that, as again has happened historically, and we saw in 1349, and there's the Justinian plague in Constantinople and other plagues through the Roman Empire. Disease could take out large portions of a population very quickly, leaving space for new populations to move into.
And crucially, without the need for mass violence or
Precisely.
some sort of because the thing is what we're talking about is a genocide on a level that even modern, I say modern, people in the last 100 years haven't, dictators haven't managed to achieve. It's such a total genocide of people. So there must have been other, well, one would think there must have been other factors, including, as you say, less food, smaller population, and possibly a disease element going on there as well.
And it's interesting as well. If just one other point I'd like to make here, Mark. If you look at the other historical examples of mass population excursions out of Central Asia, and I'm thinking about the Huns in the late Roman Empire, early medieval period. I'm thinking about the Mongols in the Middle Ages. Both those incursions were very quick, extensive, violent, but over quite quickly because they burnt themselves out. And those populations retreated back to their core territories.
Yes, they did.
So, for one to expand and stick, will, to my mind at least, one of the questions should be: isn't that actually contrary to the way these rapid, violent expansions happened elsewhere? And you have to explain why this one's different.
And it's interesting that you should mention the Hun in particular. It's a name that's synonymous with being the scourge of civilization, a movement of violent, barbaric people, a nickname that was used, for example, in the First World War, certainly by Brits, to describe the German troops. This idea of the enemy.
Exactly, but and even though we don't use that anymore because it's seen as racist, we still use the term Vandal, which is another migratory people contemporary with the Huns, and for meaningless violence.
Well, absolutely, but also crucially, it implies that those people, Hun, Vandal, have an inherent tendency towards violence, and that's something that there's actually in this article. Certainly heavily implied that the Yamnaya were simply of an order of magnitude more violent than their neighbours and than other people on the continent. And it reminds me very much of an old anthropological notion that there are some people who are just more violent, some tribes in particular. Probably the most infamous example would be the Yanomami. It's another tribal group here, but the Yanomami in South America, who for a long time were labelled as more violent, just more violent than any other humans alive, and their whole society is all about violence, endo-cannibalism and all this kind of thing, and also the need to be violent was seen as intrinsic to them. This has since been quite dramatically challenged in the realm of anthropology. These people are no more violent or less violent than other humans. But my point is, there's an ongoing academic need, it seems, to just put violence or violent acts onto certain groups of people. Or maybe it's a cultural need, I don't know. Maybe it's something a bit more intrinsic.
It's really interesting. I mean, the military historian in me immediately thinks of the rise of military powers in the past. So, for example, in Sweden in the early 17th century under Gustavus Adolphus, the Swedes suddenly developed this army that was capable of taking on all the great armies of Europe and beating them under one single monarch who reorganized the Swedish military. The same thing happened in Prussia under Frederick the Great. A small German state suddenly became one of the great European powers because the army was reorganized by this one person with the vision. In Africa, the famous example is the Zulu nation, which was a major but not massively important military power until Shaka Zulu came along in the early 19th century, created the Zulu Empire, which lasted until it was destroyed by the British in the Zulu War in the 1870s. And so there are these examples whereby societies can take a turn towards violence.
Well, but also
expansionism.
Crucially, effective violence. That's the thing.
Effective violence and expansionism in a very short period of time. Again, the question has to be whether it's so short a period of time. It's actually difficult to identify archaeologically, particularly when you have no written sources.
Yes, yeah. By definition, in prehistory.
Absolutely. The other point I make is again, and again, anybody who's studied even just the British Neolithic, and I know there are other examples recently from Germany as well, but there are known examples of what appear to be violent actions at, for example, one of the Neolithic causeway camps. And
also that that there's a very famous. This is a slightly different period, but there's a very famous massacre that happened in and around the expansion of farming into Germany. So it seems that violence happens when people move. That seems we can probably agree on that. But whether or not the people moving are simply inherently violent is something that's actually probably quite a dangerous thing to imply, I think.
Well, the other thing I think that is underlying this, and again, I don't want to go too far with this.
No.
Certainly at the moment, because I'm at a very early stage in trying to understand this particular issue. But again, the moment I started reading about this, and and the fact that it links to, there are links to expansion, of course, into India as well. So this expansion is going east as well as west, and we're back to the race theories of the mid-20th century and the Aryan invasions and the Aryans and the Untermenschen and so on. And at the extreme fringes of DNA studies, there have been accusations, for example, that people have tried to use DNA, contemporary and archaeological, to try and return to the cruder racial theories of the 19th and early 20th century, where certain people of certain ethnic backgrounds are seen as somehow less intelligent, less adaptable, or whatever. So this area has it's a moral minefield and an ethical minefield as well as an archaeological minefield.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to leave it there.
I think we probably should.
But nonetheless, an interesting story, and especially on the front page of a very good national publication. Definitely.
It's one I suspect we're going to come back to again at some point as well.
Definitely.